The afternoon sun blazed over Atlanta, and Nathan Carter walked calmly through a quiet residential neighborhood after a long day of meetings. He wore a green polo shirt and dress pants, looking like just another businessman heading home. In his pocket, he carried a stack of freshly withdrawn $100 bills. Everything seemed normal, until the sudden blare of sirens shattered the silence. Before he could react, 2 police officers jumped out of a patrol car, guns drawn and aimed straight at him. "Get on the ground! Now!" one of them shouted, while their K9s barked viciously at his side. Confused, Nathan raised his hands. "What's going on?" he asked, but there was no time for an answer. The hostility in their eyes was clear. Arguing would be pointless. With no choice, Nathan dropped to his knees and lay face down on the hot pavement. As he moved, a few bills slipped from his pocket and scattered across the sidewalk. One of the officers grabbed a bill, held it up to the sunlight, and muttered something to his partner. "Counterfeit money. We got him." Nathan's heart pounded. This was a mistake, an outrageous one. He had withdrawn that money from the bank just this morning. Before he could protest, he felt a heavy knee press into his back, pinning him against the concrete. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. "You're under arrest for possession of counterfeit money and resisting arrest," the officer declared, completely ignoring Nathan's objections. A small crowd had begun to gather, some bystanders pulling out their phones to record. A deep wave of humiliation washed over him. Nathan tried to stay calm, but rage burned inside him. He was a respected man, an influential professional, and yet here he was, treated like a common criminal. His eyes locked onto the officers. They were making a terrible mistake. Then, a chilling realization struck him. They had no idea who he was. The irony was almost laughable. These officers had just arrested their own boss. The back seat of the patrol car was cramped and suffocating. Nathan Carter sat with his wrists still bound, his muscles tense as he stared out the window. The streets of Atlanta blurred past him, but his mind wasn't on the city. He was replaying every second of what had just happened. He wanted to yell, to demand they check his ID, but he knew how that would look. A black man in handcuffs, shouting at 2 white officers? That wouldn't end well. The police radio crackled. "Unit 5-4, confirm suspect's name and status." One of the officers in the front seat, Officer Reynolds, grabbed the receiver. "Nathan Carter, charged with possession of counterfeit money and resisting arrest. Transporting to precinct now." His voice was sharp, full of confidence, like he had just made the arrest of his career. Nathan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay composed. He knew exactly what was coming next. Any moment now, dispatch would run his name, and the weight of their mistake would come crashing down on them. He watched Officer Reynolds glance at his partner, Officer Mills, who kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Then it happened. A sudden silence on the radio. Then a hesitant voice. Confirm suspect's name? Did you say Nathan Carter?" Reynolds frowned. "That's right." "Why?" Another pause. Then a new voice, this time, one filled with something that almost sounded like fear. "Officer, that man is Chief Nathan Carter, your precinct commander." Reynolds stiffened. Mills sucked in a sharp breath. The air in the car shifted instantly, thick with realization. The weight of what they had done sank in. Nathan could see it in the way Reynolds' shoulders tensed, the way Mills blinked rapidly, his grip on the wheel faltering for just a moment. They had arrested the man who ran their entire department. Nathan leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "So, do I still have the right to remain silent, or would you like to start explaining yourselves?" Mills turned his head slightly, just enough for Nathan to catch the panic in his expression. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "A misunderstanding?" Nathan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You tackled me in broad daylight, pinned me to the ground, and threw me in cuffs over money I legally withdrew from my bank. That's more than a misunderstanding, Officer Mills." Reynolds opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Nathan could see the war happening inside him, pride battling pure terror. The radio crackled again. This time, the voice was different. "Get him out of those cuffs. Now." Mills hesitated for half a second before reaching back, his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled with the key. The moment the cold metal released from Nathan's wrists, a new kind of tension filled the car. One that neither officer knew how to navigate. Nathan rubbed his wrists and stared at them, his voice eerily calm. "Drive me to the station." Reynolds' brows furrowed. "Sir, I said," Nathan cut him off, his tone final. "Drive me to the station." The silence was deafening as Mills turned on the sirens and pulled the car back onto the road. This wasn't over. Not even close. The moment Nathan Carter stepped into the precinct, the room fell into silence. Officers stopped mid-conversation, their eyes widening as they registered what they were seeing. Nathan, their chief, walking in, not as a prisoner, but as a man in control. Behind him, Officers Reynolds and Mills looked pale, their bodies tense with the weight of their mistake. At the front desk, Sergeant Lopez's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Chief Carter?" she muttered, glancing between him and the officers trailing behind. Nathan didn't slow his stride. "Get everyone into the briefing room. Now." Lopez, sensing the storm brewing, grabbed the intercom and issued the order. Minutes later, the room was packed. A mix of confusion and unease filled the air. Nathan stood at the front, his expression unreadable. "I was arrested today," he said, his voice steady but sharp. Murmurs rippled through the room. He let the words sink in before continuing. "Two of my own officers assumed that a black man carrying cash had to be a criminal." Reynolds and Mills stood frozen, avoiding his gaze. No one spoke. No one dared. Nathan's eyes swept across the room. "If this can happen to me, the chief of police, imagine what happens to those without a badge." The silence was deafening. The reality was impossible to ignore. His focus locked onto Reynolds and Mills. "Hand over your badges." The two hesitated, but they knew there was no way out. The metal clinked against the table as they placed them down. The weight of their mistake had never felt heavier. Nathan exhaled, his voice final. "This isn't over." Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the entire room in stunned silence. The drive home was silent. Nathan sat in the back seat of an unmarked police car, his hands resting on his lap, his mind racing. He had walked out of that briefing room with his head high, but inside, the anger still burned. His own officers had humiliated him in the middle of the street, and if it weren't for his title, he could have ended up in a cell, or worse. The thought made his stomach tighten. As the car pulled up to his house, Nathan exhaled and stepped out. His neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with well-kept lawns and towering oak trees. This was supposed to be his refuge, but even here, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He barely made it to his front door before his phone buzzed. It was everywhere now. News outlets had picked up the story. The headlines were brutal. Atlanta police chief wrongfully arrested by his own officers. Racial profiling at its worst, even the chief isn't safe. Nathan Carter speaks out, "This isn't over." Nathan sighed, scrolling through the flood of messages. Journalists wanted statements. Politicians were weighing in. Community leaders were demanding action. His name was on every screen in the city, and the pressure to respond was growing by the second. Before he could process it all, his wife, Camille, opened the door. Her eyes searched his face, reading the exhaustion beneath the surface. "I saw the news," she said softly. "Are you okay?" Nathan let out a slow breath. "I don't know," he admitted. He stepped inside, the weight of the day finally hitting him. He wasn't just a man who had been wronged. He was the man everyone was now looking to for justice. And he had no choice but to deliver it. Nathan barely had time to sit down before his phone started buzzing again. Calls from reporters, city officials, and even the mayor's office flooded his screen. Everyone wanted to know how he planned to handle the situation. Would he fire the officers? File charges? Address the public? The weight of expectation pressed down on him, but Nathan knew one thing. He couldn't afford to react on impulse. Camille sat beside him on the couch, watching him closely. "They're all waiting for your next move," she said. "What are you going to do?" Nathan ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. "I need to be smart. If I come out swinging, it'll look like revenge. If I do nothing, it'll be a betrayal to everyone who's ever been in my position." He paused, his mind working through the possibilities. "I need to make this bigger than me." The next morning, Nathan stood at the front of a packed press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones were pointed at him, and the city held its breath. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces expecting answers, and then he spoke. "This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about what happens every day to people who don't have the power to fight back. And it has to stop." Murmurs spread through the audience. Nathan continued, his voice steady but firm. "Effective immediately, a full independent review of department policies and training procedures will begin. Racial profiling will not be tolerated under my leadership. And the officers involved will face a formal investigation with full transparency." As the conference ended, the reaction was immediate. Some praised his leadership. Others questioned if it was enough. But one thing was clear: Nathan had just started something much bigger than himself. And there was no turning back now. Nathan sat in his office, staring at the reports stacked in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The air in the precinct felt different since the investigation had been announced. Charged, tense, like a storm waiting to break. Officers who had once greeted him with respect now averted their eyes. Conversations that used to flow easily had been replaced by hushed murmurs in the hallways. He could feel it. The resistance. The resentment. He had expected backlash from outside forces. Politicians, the media, even some members of the public who thought he wasn't doing enough. But he hadn't expected to feel it so strongly from within his own department. The people who were supposed to have his back. That reality sat heavy on his chest. A sharp knock on the door snapped him back to the present. Before he could answer, Lieutenant Harris stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His face was tight with concern. "Chief, we have a problem." Nathan exhaled, already bracing himself. "What now?" Harris hesitated for a second, as if choosing his words carefully. "Some officers think you handled Reynolds and Mills too harshly. They're saying you acted on emotion, that you're making an example out of them." He shook his head. "And now the union is getting involved. There's talk of resistance. Some officers are even saying they won't cooperate with the investigation." Nathan sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had expected anger from Reynolds and Mills, maybe even from their closest allies. But this? Officers refusing to cooperate? The very people who were supposed to uphold justice now choosing to protect their own at any cost? That was something he would not tolerate. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "They think I'm the problem?" Harris sighed. "Some do. Others are watching, waiting to see how you handle this. There are officers who believe in what you're doing, Chief. But there are also people here who don't want things to change. And those are the ones you need to worry about. Nathan ran a hand over his face, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He had spent his entire career fighting to prove that he could lead with integrity, that he could change things from the inside. And now, instead of rallying behind him, his own officers were turning against him? It made him sick. Finally, he straightened in his chair, his decision made. "Call a department-wide meeting," he said, his voice steady. "No more whispers in the halls. No more hiding behind the union. If they have something to say, they can say it to my face." Harris shifted uncomfortably. "Are you sure about this? If you put them all in one room, things could get heated." Nathan met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let's turn up the heat." The briefing room was packed. Every available officer stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Nathan walked in without hesitation, his presence commanding the room even before he spoke. He could feel the weight of their stares, the tension thick enough to choke on. "Good. Let them feel uncomfortable." He stepped to the front, resting his hands on the table as he looked out at them. "I called this meeting because I hear there's been some confusion," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Some of you think I acted emotionally when I suspended Reynolds and Mills. Some of you think I turned against my own people." His eyes swept the room. "So let's clear this up right now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others stood firm, their arms crossed, jaws tight. They weren't used to being called out like this. Nathan continued. "When I put on this badge, I swore an oath to serve and protect. Not just some people. Everyone. And yet, 2 of my own officers saw a black man with cash in his pocket and decided that was enough to take him down. No questions. No ID check. Just violence. And if that's the kind of policing you think I should defend, then you're in the wrong damn department." Silence. The kind that stretched, heavy and unrelenting. Then, from the back, a voice cut through the quiet. "So what now, Chief? You gonna fire everyone who disagrees with you?" Nathan's eyes locked onto the speaker, Detective Slater, a veteran officer with years on the force. The type who saw himself as untouchable. Nathan didn't blink. "No, Slater. But if you think you can ignore orders, undermine an active investigation, or put personal bias above your duty, then yeah, maybe this isn't the place for you." A few murmurs of agreement echoed in the room. Slater scoffed but said nothing. Nathan took a step forward. "This department is under scrutiny. Not because of the media. Not because of politics. But because we failed. And instead of standing up and fixing it, some of you are more concerned with protecting your own. If that's the hill you want to die on, be my guest. But know this, I'm not backing down. And neither is this investigation." More silence. Some officers looked away. Others stood a little straighter. And for the first time since this all began, Nathan saw something shift in the room. Doubt in the ones who resisted. Conviction in the ones who believed. He exhaled, letting the moment settle. Dismissed. As the officers filed out, Harris approached him. "You think that worked?" Nathan watched Slater push through the doors, his face tight with barely contained anger. "I think some of them got the message," he said. Then his jaw tightened. "And I think others are about to push back harder than ever." The atmosphere inside the precinct had shifted after the meeting. Nathan could feel it in the way some officers refused to meet his eyes, in the way conversations died when he entered a room. The ones who had always resented his leadership were no longer just whispering behind his back, they were planning something. The question was, how far were they willing to go? That night, as Nathan drove home, the weight of the day settled on his shoulders. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. He knew the resistance from within the department was growing, but something about this felt different. More dangerous. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. "Harris." He answered on speaker. "Tell me you've got good news." Harris let out a humorless chuckle. "Not even close. Word is, a group of officers is working behind the scenes to turn the union against you. They're saying you're making this personal, that you're letting politics cloud your judgment." His voice darkened. "And it gets worse. I checked some internal reports today. Certain cases tied to problematic officers? Details are missing. Body cam footage flagged as corrupted. Witness statements suddenly disappearing." Nathan's stomach clenched. "They're covering their tracks." "Yeah," Harris confirmed. "And they're doing it fast. If we don't get ahead of this, they'll bury any evidence before the review can catch up." Nathan exhaled, processing the reality of what was happening. This wasn't just pushback from officers who didn't like change. This was a coordinated effort to protect a system they had no intention of fixing. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, headlights in his rearview mirror. The car had been behind him for the last few turns. Close. Too close. His grip tightened on the wheel as he switched lanes. The car followed. His pulse quickened. This wasn't paranoia. This was intentional. "Something's wrong," Nathan muttered into the phone. "What do you mean?" Harris asked. Before Nathan could answer, the car behind him accelerated. Bam! The impact jolted Nathan forward, his seatbelt locking against his chest. His tires screeched as his car swerved, nearly jumping the curb. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. "They just hit me," he said, his voice sharper now. "What?" Harris's tone shifted instantly. "Nathan, get out of there." The car behind him didn't slow down. It rammed him again, harder. His tires lost traction, the back end fishtailing wildly. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't just trying to scare him. They wanted him off the road. Nathan's instincts took over. He yanked the wheel, forcing his car into a sharp turn down a side street. The other driver hesitated for half a second, then suddenly backed off. The headlights disappeared as the car sped away into the night. Breathing heavily, Nathan pulled over, his hands still gripping the wheel. His whole body was tense, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He took a second to steady his breath before grabbing his phone. "They just tried to run me off the road," he said. Harris swore. "Jesus, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Nathan said, though his pulse was still racing. He glanced around the empty street, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. This was a message. A warning. And it was the last one he was going to tolerate. "I'm done playing defense," Nathan said, his voice steady but ice-cold. Harris hesitated. "What are you thinking?" Nathan's eyes darkened. "I'm thinking it's time we find out who, exactly, in this department wants me gone. And when we do..." He clenched his jaw. "They won't see me coming." The war had just begun. Nathan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blinding headlights in his rearview mirror, felt the violent jolt of the car slamming into his. The message had been clear: back off, or we'll make you. But if they thought fear would stop him, they had made a fatal miscalculation. At sunrise, he was back in his office, his jaw tight as he scrolled through a list of officers flagged in the independent review. There were names on this list he had expected. Officers with multiple complaints swept under the rug, men who saw the badge as a weapon rather than a responsibility. But who among them had the power to erase evidence? Who had the guts to try and take him off the board? A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Harris walked in, closing the door behind him. His face was serious. "We found the car." Nathan straightened. "Where?" "Abandoned near the old rail yard," Harris said. Plates were removed, VIN scratched out. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Nathan clenched his jaw. Cowards. Any fingerprints? Harris hesitated. Nothing usable. But he placed a folder on Nathan's desk. We pulled traffic cam footage from an intersection a few blocks from the crash site. You're gonna want to see this. Nathan flipped open the folder and felt his stomach tighten. Detective Slater. There he was, caught on camera, walking away from the same car that had nearly killed him. His face partially obscured, but there was no mistaking that build, that swagger of a man who thought he was untouchable. Nathan exhaled slowly. So it's him. Harris nodded. And he's not working alone. Someone higher up is protecting him, making sure records disappear. If Slater's this bold, it means he has backing. He paused. We need to act fast, Nathan. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. Nathan shut the folder, his mind racing. Slater had just made his biggest mistake. He had let himself be seen. I want him brought in, Nathan said firmly. No favors. No special treatment. Harris hesitated. If we arrest one of our own, it's going to send shockwaves through the department. You know that, right? Nathan met his gaze. Good. Let's shake the ground they're standing on. Within an hour, a team of internal affairs officers was assembled. They moved with precision, arriving at Slater's apartment before he had a chance to run. Nathan stood outside the complex as they led the detective out in cuffs, his face a mixture of shock and fury. You set me up, Slater growled as he was shoved into the back of a patrol car. Nathan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Slater could hear. You tried to kill me. Slater smirked. Prove it. Nathan's eyes darkened. I already have. As the car pulled away, Nathan exhaled. One down. But who else was pulling the strings? His phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. A low, steady voice filled the line. You just made a big mistake, Chief. Nathan's grip tightened on the phone. The real enemy had just revealed themselves. Nathan gripped the phone tightly, his pulse steady, but his mind was racing. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The moment his real enemy, the one pulling all the strings, had finally revealed themselves. You've been a real problem, Chief, the voice on the other end said, calm and steady. But problems can be solved. Nathan's grip on the phone tightened. That so? A low chuckle followed. Slater was reckless. He wasn't supposed to act on his own. But now that you've forced our hand, you should know, this doesn't end with him. The call ended. Nathan lowered the phone slowly, his mind processing every word. This wasn't just about Slater. There were more people involved, people with power, people who had been working in the shadows to keep the system exactly as it was. And now, they saw Nathan as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Harris stood nearby, his face tense. They're getting desperate. Nathan exhaled, his thoughts sharpening. Which means we finally have them where we want them. Nathan didn't wait. That same afternoon, he called a press conference, standing before the cameras once again. This time, he wasn't just talking about the independent review or police reform. This department has been compromised, he said, his voice steady. Certain individuals have worked to obstruct justice, erase evidence, and even target me personally to keep their secrets buried. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. As of today, a joint task force between the FBI and Internal Affairs will begin a full-scale corruption probe into this department. The room erupted with questions, but Nathan didn't stay to answer them. The message wasn't for the reporters. It was for the people in the shadows, the ones who thought they could silence him. They had called to threaten him. Now, they were the ones running out of time. The investigation moved quickly. With federal oversight, no amount of missing evidence could protect those involved. Officers who once felt untouchable suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. And when the pressure hit, they started turning on each other. Within days, names began to surface. Officers, detectives, a deputy chief, and then, finally, the commissioner. Nathan sat across from Commissioner Bradley in a private interrogation room. The older man's once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering rage. He knew he had lost. "You were supposed to play along, Carter," Bradley said, his voice low. "You were supposed to be smart enough to know how things worked." Nathan leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "I know exactly how things worked. That's why I tore it down." Bradley exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And you think you've won?" Nathan stood, pushing his chair back slowly. "No," he said. "I think the city won." The arrests shook Atlanta. News outlets covered the corruption scandal for weeks. Protests erupted, some in outrage, others in celebration. Officers who had resisted Nathan's leadership suddenly found themselves scrambling to prove their loyalty. And through it all, Nathan remained exactly where he was. Unshaken. Unmoved. One evening, as he sat in his office, Harris walked in with 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," he said, placing one on Nathan's desk. Nathan shook his head slightly. "Not yet." He looked out the window at the city skyline. "Cleaning up the mess is just the beginning. Now we rebuild." Harris smirked. "Then I guess we've got work to do." Nathan took a slow sip of his coffee, the weight of everything settling. The war wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were finally winning.